Professor McCrane, thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Excited to be here.
Why don't we start up with your background? We know, where'd you start? Where have you been so far, and what are you working on now?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm a UNC Chapel Hill graduate, and then after I finished college, I moved to Washington D.C. For a few years, where I worked as an intern on the Hill, and then I did some kind of policy adjacent jobs, working a lot on Capitol Hill in kind of a nonprofit lobbying world, and then in advocacy for nonprofit organizations. So I've been following policymaking in DC for a long time. And then that sort of led me to going back to graduate school to get a political science PhD. So I finished my PhD at Emory University in 2020. I was a postdoc at Michigan State last year. I'm now an assistant professor of political science at the University of Utah. And I study a bunch of topics in public policy. Most germane to today is I study a lot of congressional capacity, congressional staff, and human capital. And then more broadly, the sort of like labor markets within political institutions and the effects that has on the kind of policy output and behavior of the politicians and government officials. So for instance, the incentives of the revolving door and what those produce in the behavior of the people who work in government. So I'm kind of broadly interested in these kind of questions about public policy making and the effects that the capacity of the institution has on policy output, in particular within the labor market.
And so was that what motivated you originally to go into this area of work, or was it something else?
Yeah, so I mean, my background is sort of like understanding both the internal workings of congressional offices, having spent time in one, and then also working a lot with the staff themselves, and then seeing the lobbying side of things, like seeing what the lobbying industry looks like, the very straightforward transition from congressional offices to the lobbying world really kind of piqued my curiosity once I started reading some of the academic literature on the revolving door. And so that kind of what led me to also studying more broadly congressional staff, and now also these questions of like how professional legislatures are, especially within the states, is sort of my view of the actual like day-to-day work of these institutions.
Well, why don't we start then, in terms of our discussion on the staffing side of things, since you have direct experience there and moving from there to the lobbying side. So what is kind of the big questions you're asking about this kind of staff question or resource or capacity, and how do you approach that? What questions are you asking? What have you found?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so I think the thing that's always struck me as interesting is that congressional staff have a very straightforward set of incentives. None of them are particularly controversial, right? It's to, it's a place where a lot of young people go, and are especially ambitious people, and they want to use it to kind of launch their careers in either something in politics, government, or something adjacent to that. And so this set of incentives produces a kind of interesting labor market where everybody is really underpaid, and they're willing to accept the fact that they're underpaid because one, there's a lot of like public service motivation among these people, and to some degree, right, where they actually do want to do stuff that benefits society and work in government. But also like, and this always struck me, as there was this like really, really straightforward idea among people working on the Hill as to like the direct value of their experience for either the next job they had in Capitol Hill, or more specifically, what they were going to be doing off of the Hill. And so that like broad set of incentives, I always found interesting and worth exploring, especially kind of vis-a-vis the lobbying industry. And then that led me to sort of think more broadly about, okay, so if staff had these incentives, how do members of Congress like construct an office and recruit and retain the kinds of people that are going to let them be effective and actually let them do the things that they're elected to do, if they can't like pay people enough to keep them around. And that's kind of like led to my broader research interest more generally on like the representational consequences of the sort of labor market incentives of the individuals that work in Congress.
And so when you've done this work, are you looking at specific roles within Congress? They're the chiefs for member offices anyway. They're the chiefs. They're the legislative directors. There's the communications directors that are typically thought of as kind of the senior team. And then there's the whole committee staff, which is a different beast. How do you approach the different kinds of roles, and are they all the incentives the same, or is it radically different from one group to another?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, so I've looked at pretty much everybody. So I think that to me, like the most interesting set of people are people who work in in the actual member offices, especially on the House side. The House side in particular is interesting because members are all sort of given the same budget, and they have to, like, essentially they're just told to like figure out how to spend $1.5 million every year on running an office. Like, we are going to give you very, very basic guidelines on this. It's totally up to you. And so kind of dividing those resources into, these broad buckets of like policy making versus, constituency service or district tasks has always been like a really interesting challenge to me. Like, how would you optimally do that if you knew what you wanted to get out of it? And so because of that, I kind of look at all sorts of the individuals in these offices, and the set of incentives is obviously different for more senior staff than it would be for more junior staff, because more senior staff actually do have a little bit more reason to stick around if they can. They're paid a little bit more. They have a lot of responsibility. They're kind of like, especially in the House, they're like really powerful people. Like, really young people can get into these really, really powerful positions because of how important individual staffers are. And sort of underlining a lot of this, my interest in this is the understanding that members of Congress rely really heavily on their staff. I'm sure you're aware of this, talking to a lot of people who work in Congress, but it's always just struck me as astounding the degree to which they're just like, and they're always just like really forthcoming about this, right? They're always super appreciative of their staff. They rely heavily on them. The academic literature supports this as well, that basically all of the kind of day-to-day stuff that we attribute to members of Congress is at some basis a function of their staff. So like, the individual importance of like one or two staffers, especially in like a House office where they have relatively small staff, is huge. And that's why I think it's really interesting to understand what the incentives of those people are.
But the power in terms of legislation typically would be centered then around the chief and the legislative director, typically, is my understanding. I don't know if that comports with what you found in your research.
Yeah, I mean, so that's generally the case, right? Is in the House, especially, like those are going to be your most experienced legislative folks. But I would keep in mind, it's not just writing the bills that's an important feature of policymaking in the House. It's what's called in the literature, that's like legislative entrepreneurship, like seeking out opportunities to kind of insert yourself in the policymaking process, to find ways to do things that your constituents want. They're going to benefit your constituents. So this is complicated. It's hard to find the information you need to be an effective policymaker. It's hard to figure out how to vote on policy that's coming up, right? It's hard to figure out like what stakeholders are going to be affected by certain kinds of policy. And so that's like a team effort. So there's a lot of people in offices that are kind of tasked with those sorts of responsibilities. In the Senate, there's a lot of people who can do that within a given office. But in the House, these individual staffers wear lots of different hats and have to like regularly take meetings and go to hearings and cover all sorts of things. They have to work with stakeholders to draft legislation. So it's not just like one or two people that have the most responsibility. It's usually spread out quite a bit. And you can have like, a 26-year-old legislative assistant who's got, 5 different policy areas that they're responsible for following. And that's a lot of responsibility, in my opinion.
So what about in terms of the committees? Did you find it's typically thought that that's where really most of the expertise lies, and the specialization. What's different about the committees than the member offices in terms of staff?
Yeah, the committee offices are sort of, and this is my understanding talking with people as well, is like, that's the kind of definitely the specialized job. It's also like the kind of really prestigious job, right? If you're like a senior committee staffer, you're a policy expert in that field. It's a really good job. The salaries are usually higher in committees. And, also what's important to keep in mind, right, is that staff in personal offices are always subject to their member losing. They're not given any sort of civil service protection, so they can be fired at will. So, I mean, in general, even along those dimensions, working a committee is a better job for most people, especially now that staff can get paid a little bit more, which we can talk about later. And so like committee staff tend to be much more specialized experts. So they're faced with sort of different career concerns along those lines. And I've done some work that shows that, you know, that if for those committee staff that do go into like the lobbying industry, they go into much more like specialized technical policy kinds of roles instead of these kind of broader, you know, contract lobbyists that are like your kind of your typical mental image of what a lobbyist looks like.
So let's move on then to compensation. So, and turnover. So I'm sure that, you know, we've done work obviously in this area, as we discussed, looking at turnover, looking at, you know, the tenure of your average staffer. You know, have you looked at these issues in compensation? Have you looked at these issues? What have you found so far? What do people know, and what do they think they know, and what have you found?
Yeah, this is probably my favorite area to study in Congress because, and this is something that always struck me as pretty wild, is that the data to actually study this is it's like a non-trivial task to wrap your hands around this data. It's massive, it's public, but it's really messy. And so the Congressional Research Service, CRS, creates some reports on like this stuff, but they only use like small samples of the data because it is so hard to use. And I've found in my work that Congress itself doesn't really have a good sense of these broad, like kind of macro labor market things that are just, you know, because it's just so hard to understand it in the data. So for instance, I have a bunch of research that looks at various features of this. So one of my favorite things, for instance, is that on average, since the early 2000s, only 50% of staff have careers that last more than 2 years. And so for a frame of reference, the Office of Personnel Management says that over 50% of federal bureaucrats have careers more than 13 years. So, I mean, this is a feature of Congress, right? Is there's so much churn, there's so much turnover. It's meant to be a place where people go for just a little bit and then leave. But that's like a really interesting problem because so one thing that we think from the academic literature on this is that the way you get people to invest in expertise that's related to the thing that they do, like their job, the place they work, in this case, like the congressional office or district in which they work, is you give them the ability to stay, right? If you give them the ability to stay, which includes, you know, career protections, adequate salaries, especially salaries that are at least somewhat competitive with what the outside option would be, then those people will invest in this, what we call like relationship specific expertise, the expertise that's specific to the job they're doing. So I would suggest, like, especially in personal offices in Congress, there's very little incentive for an individual to do that, especially if they work in an office that is at risk of losing an election, right? Because then what your incentive is it's to position yourself to be well placed to move to a different office or to move off the Hill and really take advantage of the experience you had and make money doing it. And this is not to suggest that that's negative. That's just a straightforward risk averse consideration, right? You want to make sure that if you're going to lose your job tomorrow, you're well positioned to find another one. And so I think that is super interesting because, you know, that and if you aggregate up all of these individual level preferences along that dimension, this idea that the people are really strategic about positioning themselves for the next job and not necessarily the current one, then what you find is that members who don't offer these like really enticing places to work based on, you know, either the fact that they're in competitive districts, you know, maybe they're junior members who can't do much like real policymaking work, maybe they're offices that have to do a bunch of constituency service work because of the kinds of districts they represent. So if you take those things into account, what happens is those offices can't really offer lots of these really appealing jobs to staff who want to stay or to want to really invest and become really good at that job. And so what I find in my research is that those kinds of offices, those junior members, those members in like these really kind of poor districts that have to do a lot of constituency service work, they attract like less experienced staff with fewer kinds of credentials that you would think would be good on Capitol Hill, and they have higher turnover among those staff. So it's like those offices are sort of at a disadvantage because they cannot attract and retain the kinds of staff that will enable them to be really effective members of Congress.
Right. If they don't see a career, it's going to be tough to attract people who want to.
I mean, and as somebody who's worked in the private sector, right, you would know that this is not a particularly unique concept. It's like if you want to attract the best people, you need to give them a reason to come there. And if it's not salary, right, which on the Hill, it's typically not. So I have research that shows the average salaries of most Hill jobs are terribly low. So for instance, in the House in 2018, the average legislative assistant is making like $50,000 a year. And, you know, DC is an expensive place to live. And that is a very important job. Even if they're young people doing it, it's an important job. And so if you're not offering them salaries, right, what are you offering them? Well, you're offering them the credential of being on the Hill and doing really important policy things. But that's just to sort of substitute for salary so that they can then make that salary up in the future when they leave. And so like, if you can't offer either salary or that opportunity, how are you going to attract the kinds of like really high quality types that you need to be an effective member of Congress?
Unless there's an overwhelming supply of such people. So I'm curious about the supply. Where does it come from?
You know, this is a great question and something we actually don't know a ton about. So one thing that we do know is that there obviously is a large supply of people. And so even these offices that don't offer these really good places to work on those dimensions I just talked about, they're still going to obviously be able to fill these roles. But again, there's no reason for those staff to stay in those roles, right? So what I find is that staff like move offices all the time, and they're especially moving into better looking offices along those dimensions. So that's one thing that is sort of a feature of this market. But the other feature of this market where, you know, these especially entry level jobs are really low paid is it produces a system where prominently wealthy people from wealthy backgrounds are able to take advantage of those jobs, essentially. Like people who don't have to worry too much about making $25,000 a year for a couple of years can take those jobs. So what this does is it produces kind of broader inequalities in the workforce in Congress. This is something that Congress has started paying attention to their credit. But it's you know, we can talk about this later when we talk about reforms, but this is a hard thing to fix. So that's one issue. The other issue is that Congress has historically not offered great benefits to its staff. And partly this is because members are able to kind of structure their benefits however they want to a degree. It's totally up to them how they run their office. So another thing we've seen, and I have research on this, is we see these pretty substantial gender pay gaps in Congress because of a couple of reasons. One is that women who want to have families, and you know, and we know from the literature, right, that the burden of childbearing is prominently on women. They can't stay in Congress because there's not good benefits for childcare. There's not good benefits for leave. The working conditions are terrible. So what we see is at these top levels, especially in staff, we have these massive gender pay gaps because it's mostly that women tend to filter out from these senior roles. So that's another sort of kind of equilibrium outcome of the way the current structure works. And we can talk about like some alternatives that might kind of ameliorate those sorts of problems.
So for the staff compensation situation, is it equal across all roles, or some roles, you know, market and other roles are way below market, or is it pretty much even across the board that everybody's taking a 50% pay cut off what they would get in the private sector?
Yeah, you know, so this is again one of my favorite things to talk about, because I also get the strong sense that Congress does not have a good understanding of its own problem here. So I wrote this piece up for the Washington Post Monkey Cage blog about Nancy Pelosi's recent push to increase the ceiling that staff can get paid, which is like, it seems like, oh yeah, that makes a lot of sense. We should make it such that really high quality staff have the ability to get paid more. And that's probably going to be, you know, a good thing for a very few number of staff, right? So the staff who are already making a lot of money will probably make more money. Committee staff who are making a lot of money are going to make more money. You could still make an argument that it's not as competitive with outside wages still, and it's probably not, but it's not going to be like massive, right? They're still making enough money to comfortably live on in DC. So those are the kinds of people we're not super worried about, right? These like chiefs of staff or these really senior committee staff. In the Senate, like there's a decent number of people who actually do make good wages, but it's like this bottom tier of staff who are these junior staff or especially these like constituency service staff, they're still going to get underpaid like crazy, right? I mean, and there's no world where, especially the kinds of backgrounds these people have coming into the Hill, like there's no world where they're going to make that little money, especially in DC. And there's no reason to suspect that by raising the top amount that staff can make, that's going to have any impact at all on the lower ranked staff. And again, like these people do a lot of the day-to-day work in Congress. They filter through what constituents want. They parse information. They work with stakeholders. I mean, it's not a trivial job these people have. And they are making, you know, so for instance, a legislative correspondent, which is a pretty common entry level, sort of like second step up from entry level in most Hill offices, on your way towards like a legislative assistant job. I mean, they're making under $40,000 a year. And these are people with like graduate degrees, with very, very impressive resumes. And it's, you know, it's not clear like you would stay in that role if you didn't have an exit strategy.
Yeah, for the staff, you know, when we're talking about these different roles, we're talking about the compensation, you know, I do recall Newt Gingrich, at least my understanding is that at that point, there was a backlash against too much staff because, you know, they were getting too much power, according to some reports or whatever. And so they slashed the staff and tried to, you know, bring that power back to the members. So, I mean, it sounds like you're more an advocate of stronger staff, more capacity in the staff as compared with, less staff or less expertise in Congress. So what would be kind of your recommendation and why would you take that position?
Yeah. Well, I mean, you know, I don't know if I want to say necessarily I'm an advocate of a certain position. I would say that if our goal as a society is a certain thing, then there's a pretty straightforward, you know, policy direction to pursue it, right? So if Newt Gingrich's perspective is that Congress should be doing less on its own and relying more on either internal sources of expertise, such as like nonpartisan ones, such as the CBO or the Congressional Research Service, and we're also relying more on external sources of expertise, such as lobbyists, then definitely what you would want to do is reduce the number of staff that members have access to. Like that would be the way you would do that. So on the other hand, if our goal is to make Congress more self-reliant, right, to allow members to respond to the idiosyncrasies of their districts, what their constituents want, and to have to rely less on lobbyists to make complex policy, then yeah, we want them to have more expertise, right? We want them to have a better ability to do that stuff on their own. And there's other things you could think of pursuing towards that end, which is increasing the amount of resources that these what they call internal service agencies have within Congress. These places like CBO or CRS. There used to be others that have gone away. And if we gave them more money, then maybe you could imagine that members of Congress would go to them as like a nonpartisan source. But that also does not seem very, you know, popular. So I think that, you know, I think the thing with having staff being too powerful is certainly something you could consider, but like the alternative would be you don't have members who can really do anything on their own. And so my colleague Jim Curry, who you've talked to, what he shows is that it's probably the case that congressional leadership would prefer that members aren't able to do much on their own. Because what that does is it makes them rely on leadership. It gives leadership a lot of power and control over their individual members. So you've got this sort of like tension between what is probably like net positive from a like normative society perspective, and what members might want. But you've also got this like trade-off with what congressional leadership probably wants, which is not the same thing, because they would like to have have all of the policy expertise and capacity within their own ranks and be able to sort of dole it out to their members.
So, you know, you mentioned the CRS and other kinds of third parties. I mean, one of the criticisms of increasing the member budget is that they'll just spend it on constituent service and they'll be no smarter than they were before, but they'll be more likely to be reelected. instead of, and they already have a budget of, as you said, of $1.5 million, or so, 16 people in the House, and in the Senate, was it around 50 or 60, something like that? So if those are the incentives a member has, then it would, if you really want to build expertise, it sounds like you would put more money into the CRS and other kinds of dedicated research bodies. Is that kind of where you come down, or do you think you should give more money to the discretion of the member?
That's a fantastic question. And I think something Congress needs to think about more, because I don't see a lot of discussion of this coming from the Modernization Committee. Because the Modernization Committee thinks that members need more money and they need bigger budgets, and that will fix the staffing salary problem and the revolving door problem. I disagree with all of that. I don't think that's going to fix anything, because of exactly what you're talking about, right? Members are able to spend the money essentially how they want. And so one thing that I've found is that previous increases to members' representational allowances, this bucket of money they're given to spend on their offices and stuff, has not produced any additional spending on staff salaries at all. So a lot of what they spend the money on is either maybe hiring an additional staffer, or like stuff like franked mail, which is partly constituency service, or just other kind of constituency service related tasks. So yeah, I would agree that it's not obvious at all that higher MRAs are going to produce kind of like net positive increases in terms of like policymaking capacity. So yeah, so one approach that I do think that, I think the Modernization Committee does know is probably necessary is, better funded and more like opportunities to work with these internal sources of expertise. Another approach that I don't really see considered, and partly because I think it's going to be really unpopular among congressional leadership, is something that's more like the federal civil service for staff, where they work for like the institution itself and not the members. And the salary scales are sort of set to like a grade scale level. And they're through that, they're given sorts of career protections and really straightforward salary increases. I mean, that would be a huge reform. But it seems to me like something like that is what's going to be necessary to fix a lot of these underlying issues that won't be addressed just by giving members more money to spend every year.
Well, that would require a centralization of HR, basically, which,
Yep.
and I don't know the history of it, back to the beginning, but it would stand to reason that you would have centralized HR, right? And just all the things that you mentioned. I mean, if anything else, it puts the loyalty of the staff towards the institution rather than to the member. But I guess that's the crux of the problem, isn't it? Where you have that's not what the member wants.
Yeah, so this is the puzzle. So one of the like classical stories for why the staffing structure looks this way is it's because members need the ability to flexibly respond to what their districts look like, what their constituents want, et cetera. And if you take away that control, then maybe we've actually reduced the effectiveness of members of Congress, at least along one dimension. So it's a trade-off. I mean, it's a complicated thing to figure out, is to how to make it such that we can get both of these things. I mean, I do think that there's a degree to which, Congress could say, these are like the minimum salaries for these job positions. And, you have to pay people these sorts of salaries. And also, these are the benefits you get, and you have to offer these kinds of benefits. So there might be something like a middle ground, but I don't see a universe where telling members of Congress how they have to spend their money is something that's going to pass.
So what about in terms of these, the CRS and other bodies, how does it work there? Or have you looked at that question, in terms of their compensation, their longevity and their positions and in, the expertise, that in theory is that, accessible by members?
I actually don't know much about that. That would be a really interesting thing to study, is like the human capital within these agencies. I have to imagine it's higher because, it is more of like a technocratic job. And I know a lot of people in CRS, a lot of PhDs in political science in CRS, and they've been there for a long time. But yeah, that's a good question. I actually don't know much about that.
So if we kind of take the middle ground, which is between, I guess there's CRS on the one side, and there's the member on the other side. In between, there's the committees where there's some expertise, right? And maybe more of a career path for some types of staffers. In the committees, though, you have this issue of partisan resources, right? And I know you've done some work on that. Can you talk about, what happens when it comes to staff resourcing and party?
Yeah. So, I mean, so it seems like, right, that committee resources might be something that are beneficial, generally speaking, to the members of the committee. And I don't, everything that I've found, and I've talked to a bunch of people, especially people from like leadership positions or people in the offices of, committee chairs, and essentially the committee resources are only responsive to the chair or the ranking member. And so I've talked to people, for instance, you've told me that, if somebody from the committee chair or from the committee comes and talks to them, who's in an office not in the committee chair's office, they think that person is purely just speaking on behalf of the committee, and then through them, the committee chair or ranking member, and not necessarily saying something that is particular to that office and to that office's sort of environment. So in other words, these resources are really just owned by the committee chair, and they get to use them how they want. And so they don't really benefit other people in the committee to any real degree. And so that's why part of the reason it's really nice to become a committee chair, and it's a really powerful job, is you do have access to this really big pool of resources that are kind of fully under your control. And it seems, and everything I've found is like both parties sort of benefit whenever they're in leadership. It's not like a big partisan difference here. So it is sort of like a big reason why becoming a committee chair is a really nice gig.
So, but I don't think all committees don't work exactly the same in this regard, right? There are some that have, bipartisan staffs and they sort of all work together. And then there are others that are straight up split. There's the Republican staff and then there's the Democratic staff, and they don't like or talk to each other unless they have to. Is that really what you found, and what's the resolution? That doesn't seem like an optimal way to run the resources of a committee.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. So I haven't done a ton of like empirical work on this, but I've talked to a number of people about this specifically. And essentially my understanding is most committees are pretty split. Like you work for the majority or minority, but there is difference in committees to the degree to which the work is partisan. So pretty much like a lot of committees will retain the same staff regardless of who's in the majority or minority, because they're more just like straight technocratic staff. It's a good question though as to which committees that is. And as far as I know, that's not something that we have an answer to, and would probably be worth pursuing.
And when you think about committees, what is the expertise that the staff really has? Is it about the law that exists that committee covers? Is it new problems or ideas that are on the table? Is it who to talk to get something passed? What really is the function that the staff is performing?
Yeah, I mean, so basically everything you said, right? So these are going to be people who are more like federal bureaucrats in the sense of their backgrounds. They're going to be like really technocratic experts in a particular policy area, but they're also going to have a lot of like process knowledge and process expertise, like actually understand how things work on the Hill. You'll see a lot of people with a lot more kind of professional or graduate degrees as well. So a lot of lawyers, a lot more PhDs, that sort of thing, because they are doing like something that's very specialized. And so, yeah, they're really processing a lot of information. They're working on very specific kind of like working with federal agencies, for instance, on how it works, how the legislation works with regulatory policy. They're working with stakeholders who are relevant to sort of, again, get a good sense of what the effects of legislation will have. So yeah, much more technical and less political, I would say.
So, but the one thing that surprises me about the committees, because they're typically talked about as having all this expertise, but they can't possibly have the expertise really needed to draft legislation. I mean, the executive branch has got all kinds of regulators that are there full time and and even they don't have the expertise of the private sector in any particular place where they're regulating. So it would seem that although the committees are typically referred to as bastions of expertise. My impression is that it would be difficult for them to really have enough expertise to do legislation. So is their function really to kind of like gather other expertise together and like, get the right witnesses to bring more value, or are they themselves providing the expertise function rather than some kind of, some kind of coordination function to get other expertise?
That's a good question. I think it's a bit of both, right? I think it's a degree of, they sort of know the questions to ask, right? And the people that they need to bring into the process. So committees, like you said, they do work a lot with agencies because so much of legislative policy has to do with how it's going to be implemented within the agencies. I think committees still work pretty actively with stakeholders. I mean, I've met with committee staff when I was a lobbyist. And mostly that's like an informational thing, right? Like, because I mean, lobbyists, like, they know the environment, right? They know the policy environment, like they know, especially about like specific issues. And so they might have a particular view on it, but they also know exactly who's going to be affected and like the really deep, the detailed stuff about, like telecommunications policy, which is really complicated. So I think it's part of that. I think it's like a combination of like sort of a coordination thing where you can coordinate the stakeholders and the federal agency folks, as well as sort of the working directly for the committee leadership as well. So I think it's a really complicated task, and I'm not clear. It's not clear to me like exactly like if we, like for instance, if committees had like a ton more resources, if it would work much different, because there's still a degree to which it's idiosyncratic to a particular policy issue. So I know there's a lot of work recently on kind of committee capacity. I'm working on some stuff as well, but it's hard to tie exactly into, because so much of this is not really public. We don't really see the degree to which they work with stakeholders. And so it's hard to understand exactly the role that outside sources have within the committee process itself.
Yeah, I mean, I wonder whether, if you had a committee, whether you'd rather invest resources in hiring more experts, giving the existing experts more money, or providing them some kind of apparatus to collect expertise from third parties in a more efficient manner, right? I mean, I would think that, with the technology, you'd be able to connect to more experts outside of Congress, and they would serve more of a coordination function that would have the highest kind of return on investment if you're looking at how to bolster committee capacity.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really good question. I mean, I think congressional committees are definitely an area where you want to give the people who want to stay the ability to stay, right? So like that, from that angle, like offering more money is probably good, right? We don't want to be, committees don't want to be losing people to the private sector to work in the same policy areas. So that's probably one dimension. But I think, another way to frame, I think what you're asking is like, what's the diminishing marginal return of giving them more money? And that's a great question, because I think, again, to a certain degree, there are always going to be stakeholders that have to be worked with and often are writing the legislation initially in the first place. So it's unclear that would actually change.
Right. One other question I have related to this, this resources, and I know you've looked at congressional resource usage, et cetera, on the member level, but then there's also the committee level where there's a lopsided resource for the majority party. Have you looked at that and what that means? Does it mean that the minority actually has even less power in the House than would be implied by its numerical, within the ratio between the parties? What does it mean in the Senate? In terms of like, if I'm an average Republican or Democrat, I'm in the minority or majority, does it impact my power? Does it impact what happens in Congress?
I don't think that there's much party difference here. I mean, the only thing that I would say that's a big party difference is what you find is that Republican members of Congress spend less of their budgets that they're allocated every year. And part of that is because there's like a principled position that they take on sending some of it back to the Treasury. But that's a choice that's being made. So, I haven't found like hardly any difference systematically in, by party in terms of how this sort of like human capital resource use thing works, besides that, which is primarily driven by a handful of members who just don't spend all of their money. But other than that, they're kind of all faced with the same constraints.
And what about in committees? Is it the same situation?
In my experience, yeah, I think it's basically the same deal. There's this cadre of professional committee staff who stick around and work for minority or majority. Some of them are partisan, some of them are not. And I don't think that there's really any partisan advantage here.
Got it. Well, let's move on to, unless you have another topic on on staff or congressional capacity you'd like to discuss, we can move on to the other big topic, which is news.
Yeah, that sounds great.
So I know you've done some work, as it relates at least to local news, and how that impacts the incentives that lawmakers have, right, on a state level. I don't know if you've done that for Congress. Can you talk through what your research is in this area, what questions are you asking, and what have you found?
Yeah, so there's a couple, like one piece of background information, right, is we know that the news environment, in particular, like the coverage of politicians, affects the accountability of those politicians, right? So if voters know more about the behavior of politicians, then they're more likely to kind of hold them accountable and re-elect the good ones and elect somebody else if it's a bad one. So that's kind of the general principle behind the kind of a research on media effects in politics. So I have research that shows that the local media environment is changing quite a bit. This is something a lot of other people have talked about. And in particular, I show that with Greg Martin, that there's this media ownership group called Sinclair, which is this like very partisan, massive media conglomerate that's buying up all of these local news stations. And what they do when they buy up a station, and what we find is that these stations are spending less of their time on local politics and more time on national politics. And the political coverage they have is more slanted to the right relative to other stations in the same media market. So this is part of this broader trend in the kind of political media, where consumers of media want more national political coverage and less local political coverage. And it's this trend of like this nationalization of media more broadly, where it's like this handful of media owners own like the vast majority of media outlets in the country, especially in newspapers. And so what that means is there's incentive for these national conglomerate media producers to centralize the production of content and then push it out to their local affiliates, because it costs less for them to do that than it costs them to hire a bunch of local reporters. So the effects this would have on members of Congress is a couple. One is that it makes, just in general, the news environment more nationalized. So it's no longer members of Congress are responding as much to local issues. It's more like congressional races are becoming more nationalized. They're running on things that the presidential campaigns are running on, right? These big national issues, because voters just know less about the local political landscape. So that would be a big effect, right? And so some people have tied this sort of idea to increasing like polarization in the electorate, where the sort of dividing lines are now like in pretty much all races are on these big national issues instead of more kind of idiosyncratic local things. So that's definitely a big thing. One thing that Greg Martin and I are looking at too is sort of the effects of these changing media environments on like the re-election rates of politicians. The idea being like, if you know less about the local political landscape, you're more just likely to elect the incumbent, because incumbents have an advantage for a number of reasons. So that's another thing that we're finding, is that there is like this increased incumbency advantage given the decrease in local media coverage.
You mentioned earlier that there's a less demand for local news coverage. Is that really the case, or is it just there's less ability to make money doing so?
It's a good question. It's a very good question. So the general kind of conventional wisdom is there's less demand for local news. It's extremely hard to tie that with the fact that, or to like sort of separate that from the fact that the economy for news is changing, right? So I think the consensus is that the sort of demand for more national news is happening first, and that's producing less local news, and that sort of creates this feedback loop, right? I mean, but there is a feature of this too, where the economics for media have changed a ton, right? Like, so newspapers can no longer really, a lot of local newspapers can no longer sustain themselves because advertising revenue has dropped substantially, and subscription revenue is not enough to make up the difference. So that's definitely a feature of the media environment. Another feature of the media environment is the conglomerate ownership of local media sources, where like a few major ownership groups are buying up all of the local news sources. And that produces these like economies of scale. And that's another feature. So I think kind of more simply, then there's like, you've got this like sort of vicious feedback loop that's producing both of those things.
Yeah, I mean, I wonder, it's just the cost of acquiring a local news outlet has dropped so low that anyone with a political position can buy one and use it as their mouthpiece, right? Whereas in the past, it would have been too expensive to execute that strategy because those were operating businesses with profits, and would have been hard to control them. At least that's one theory.
Yeah, I mean, so that's actually what's kind of interesting about this is like the local media landscape in like the 19th century was an extremely partisan thing. Like it was just like there were straight party newspapers, and that was the local media in a lot of places. And then we went away from that to more like traditional, like journalistic outlets with lots of resources, especially in newspapers, which were almost always propped up entirely by advertising money. And then the advertising money went away, and now we're getting back to this world of like, it's affordable to buy these outlets. So some very politically motivated groups are buying these outlets for that purpose. And that is 100% the case. What it seems to be Sinclair's business model is that's what they're doing. It's less clear if that's happening at the newspaper level, but I haven't really seen any research on that either. But yeah, so I think that, we're moving back to this sort of like somewhat like 19th century era local media. The problem being, though, is that now there are a lot of areas that just don't have any local news at all.
So what does it do for the legislators, right? I mean, do they actually read the news that's local, or do they not care? Are they responding? Are they just, how does it actually impact them? Do they ever care about what happens in that news outlet? Are they only looking at social media at this point? What's really going on?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. I mean, so I think the consensus is this has changed a lot, especially over like the last decade. So like what we knew from research that was conducted on like the 1990s to 2000s is that the kind of media environment, like for instance, there's a really awesome paper by some economists, Ginskow and Shapiro, that shows that the number of media outlets that overlapped a congressional district. So for instance, you have like congressional districts in cities that have lots of media outlets. So basically, the more coverage of a member of Congress, because they had more media outlets covering them, it makes the member of Congress more accountable to the voters, right? Because voters know more about them. Members of Congress think their actions are more likely to be covered by the media outlets. So there's this idea then that they are really responsive to this because they're worried about, upsetting their constituencies, especially their like what we would call their electoral constituencies, the people that elect them specifically. I don't really know what that would produce today, right? Like if that's the case, given both the media environment we just talked about, and also that social media sort of facilitates reaching directly those like most, the strongest supporters, like directly. So I'm not really sure, like if members of Congress, especially like relatively new ones, have the same kind of mental picture of what the media environment does to their reelections. And I haven't really seen too much research on that. It'd be really interesting to study.
Yeah, it would also be interesting to understand the nature of the coverage has changed. Like, my understanding is that in the old days, the local news might be more positive on what the member was doing. It's kissing babies, the working hard in Congress to.
Or it's like easy to get good news coverage. Yeah.
Right. Whereas now they don't have that. Maybe typically if they see them in the news, it's going to be in a negative light, I would guess.
That's a great question. I would love to know. I mean, so we could definitely study this within local TV news for sure, is to see the degree to which like the coverage of actual like members of Congress is of a certain kind of valence, is like positive or negative. That would be really interesting to know.
All right, well, good. Well, how about we move on to our common questions we ask all our guests, see
Sure.
if we can someday compare the answers. If you're ready for that phase.
Sure.
So the first question I have here is, what do you think congressional representation should mean?
I mean, I guess my brief answer to that would be the ability of members of Congress to actually represent their constituents' beliefs, or to actually produce policy that their constituents want. So what we know from research is that politicians, especially members of Congress, have pretty wrong views about their constituents' opinion about a lot of important policy issues. And from, kind of work like mine, we know that it's hard for members of Congress to produce policy. So like some combination of both of those things, increasing like better knowledge of their constituents and more expertise to do the things that their constituents want, is like is sort of like what I think of as congressional representation.
Okay, so that's interesting. So you've combined the concept of expertise and of beliefs, which usually are opposed in models of representation. So I guess maybe we'll ask this way: do you think a member represents the whole district, or just like the primary or the voters, or where do you come down on that first question?
I mean, there have been so many books written about this. I mean,
And this is a should question, so this is your personal opinion, not necessarily what they actually do.
I mean, I think members should obviously represent their whole districts, but I don't know the degree to which that's a reality. I mean, or even practical. I mean, I think that members of Congress should have the ability to represent whoever they think they need to be representing. Like, I think there's like a sort of even more base level of should here, which is like have the ability to represent whoever they view as their kind of electoral or broader constituency.
And when they do that representation, do you see them as, it sounds like on the one side, you think they should reflect their beliefs versus that trustee model where they make judgments on their behalf?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's important to have like an informed view of what their constituents want. Like if their constituents want so for instance, if their constituents want gun control legislation and they just believe that they don't, like that's something that that's a fundamental flaw that needs to be fixed.
Got it. So you're heavier on the side of beliefs.
Yeah, I think beliefs and the ability to act on them.
Great. All right. Well, so the next question is, how would your ideal Congress allocate its time?
Well, I mean, I think the ideal breakdown is not too far off of like the actual calendar right now. But the problem is so much of their time is spent fundraising that the calendar breakdown does not really represent reality. So, I mean, the ideal way would be they just have to spend less time fundraising, but that is a extremely complicated problem to solve.
So you think reduce the fundraising and the current calendar, which is it 2 weeks on, 1 week off, 1 week off concept, or where is it now?
Yeah, I don't know off the top of my head exactly what it is, but yeah, I mean, I think it's important that members, I've always thought that it's important that members spend a lot of time in the districts, right? And this idea that members of Congress aren't working, but X number of weeks a year because that's when they're in DC is not, to me, that's not true. Like they're working in their districts.
Got it. And do you have an opinion on the legislation versus oversight concept in terms of how they should allocate their time?
I don't think the allocation is necessarily off. I think it's, again, comes to this question of can they do both effectively? And I would suggest that definitely oversight is extremely hard to do and not being done effectively, largely because of capacity issues.
And by that, you mean the staffing expertise? And
yeah, more broadly, just like expertise available to members of Congress to understand what they're overseeing.
Got it. All right. Well, the next question is, how should debate, deliberation, or dialogue occur or be structured in Congress? Should it be in committees? Should it be on the floor? Should it be in back rooms? Should it be out in public? should it be at retreats? What's your thought on how these different forms of communication should happen?
I don't have a lot of priors on this. This isn't really my area of expertise. I would say the only thing that I do think probably needs more of is more actual backroom negotiation, because it does give members the ability to make deals to get things done. I mean, I think that in general, I think as voters, we want Congress to be doing a little bit more than they are. And I think that's one of those things that would actually facilitate that.
So you're in favor of a little bit more backroom dealing?
Yeah, I mean, like in a non sort of, nefarious way. This for the same reason that like earmarks are probably good, is because it allows just more kind of compromise.
Got it. Next question is, what fundamental institutional improvement should Congress make within 50 years?
That's a great question. I would say something like really institutionalizing its internal expertise. I mean, again, this is, what I think about the most. And, as we've talked about, that's a complicated reality to think through. But I mean, the basic principles of this, which are making this a job that people can do and not have to live in poverty or have to purely audition for, post Congress jobs to do, like anything along those dimensions will be a massive improvement. So there's models that exist in other countries where you have vast resources available for internal nonpartisan expertise. That would be definitely one improvement that could be made, is like really, really increasing those sorts of resources and incentivizing members to use them.
So maybe I can ask a little follow-up question to that relates to our earlier discussion, which is this notion of expertise. It sounds like to you, expertise means human beings that are employees basically of the legislative branch. Now there's alternatives, which are like, we have a big database and, there's no staff, there's just members and this database, right? And the database just continues to be filled with stuff and the members can access it, right? They're super Google. So when you talk about expertise, are you talking about the concept of expertise? Are you talking about a concept of the staff that have expertise? Can you just elaborate a little bit more in defining this concept of expertise, just so I have a better handle on that?
Yeah, no, I mean, that's a great question, right? So, I mean, there's one part of this where, we can't make members use the resources they have, right? Like if members of Congress like Madison Cawthorn want to just completely ignore the ability they have to use policymaking expertise, then they will continue to be able to do so. And there's not much, we can't do anything about that. That's up to voters, right? But I think that we can create, I think Congress can create, and we as voters should support the ability to access adequate resources to understand things, either in voting, in reading legislation and producing legislation, right? I mean, like so many members of Congress right now rely on lobbyists to write bills for very straightforward reasons, which is it's complicated and time consuming, and lobbyists have the ability and resources to do it. And like, that's something that we can fix, I think, for the members who want to fix it, right? And that's sort of like all we can offer is like, so in that sense, an expertise is like, it's like this just pool of resources that's available and members are incentivized to use it.
Okay, but typically you see it as embodied in human beings, and the best way to keep that knowledge there is to give them a path for a career and build up additional expertise.
Yeah, and maybe it's not personal office staff that's going to fix this, right? Because like, again, that's going to be complicated. But I think, like a good first step is producing like a strong, in like really like lots of different resources in the institution itself that are paid by the institution that members believe are trustworthy sources of information like that. And that's going to obviously come through human capital, but we can structure the institution such that the human capital is like aggregating up to this nice thing.
Got it. So your view is a pretty broad one of expertise in Congress, and you think the if we think about fundamental improvements in Congress to build that expertise up, the path of least resistance is to pay staff more and give them a career.
Yeah, I mean, to some version of that, right? I mean, it's not obvious like how to structure that in a good way, but again, like I mean, the reason that it doesn't bind in an electoral setting that lots of members introduce bills written by lobbyists because everybody does it. And so like if it becomes less of an accepted thing, then maybe we can start to change that. And then also members can actually write their own bills if they have people they can rely on to do it, like, and who actually have expertise in doing it.
Right. Great. Well, the next question is, what book or article most shaped your thinking with respect to congressional reform?
Jim Curry's book, Legislating in the Dark, honestly. And I'm going to send him this interview, but that's what really shaped my perspective on this idea that there's just this massive asymmetry in sort of like policy capacity. And it's kind of by design.
Excellent. Well, the last question is really about yourself. What are your plans for your research in the long run? Is it still the capacity issue? Do you have other kinds of ideas on the back burner that you want to explore at some point?
Yeah, absolutely. So I have a couple papers I'm trying to get published on kind of these big topics we talked about today, like the labor market within Congress and sort of what that means for members, right? Both looking at the individual staffer labor market and then like how that aggregates up to the office level. And then I have papers on the way that members use their resources and how that looks systematically different based on the kind of district they represent. With the idea there being that potentially, we observe all these inequalities in policymaking, especially like poor people we think are underrepresented. So what I argue is at least part of the reason that's true is because members of Congress who represent poor districts are losing in the staff labor market, are not able to hire the kinds of people who help them make policy, even if they wanted to. So that's kind of like on my kind of Congress capacity side. But I have a lot of work in progress, both survey experiments and observational stuff on legislative professionalism within states. So this is where you really see massive diversity in how much resources members have. Like, so in Utah, they have like no staff. It's a part-time legislature. They're not paid much, versus like California, which is much more of a congressional model. And that's really important, right? And that really produces differences in how voters are represented, because I mean, if you have no staff and no background in a policy area, how are you supposed to do anything? You either don't, or you rely exclusively on outside interests. And so that, to me, that's a really important question. So yeah, that's my broad interest in sort of like legislative capacity and professionalism. I have work in policing policy on like the human capital and policing that I'm working on now. I have work on the federal bureaucracy, on the kind of human capital and federal bureaucracy, the revolving door in the federal bureaucracy. So I'm really interested in these like kind of labor market considerations more broadly in politics and policy.
Excellent. Well, Professor McCraney, thank you so much for your time. It's been a pleasure, and best of luck with future work.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I really enjoyed the conversation. You have some excellent questions.
Thank you. And you had some excellent answers. Much appreciated.